Hi, I tell very exciting and horrifying stories to everyone. I suggest you subscribe because I post such stories every day. Underscore the whispering woods underscore. Hashtag the beginning of the nightmare. Nestled in the heart of Blackthorn County was a dense forest the locals called Whispering Woods. For decades, stories circulated about people entering the woods and never returning. Some spoke of a deranged killer who lived there. Others whispered about a curse that drove people mad. Whatever the truth, few dared to venture in, until a group of friends, young and reckless, decided to test the legends. Chris, the leader of the group, was the kind of guy who thrived on dares. When someone at a party mentioned the woods, he smirked. "It's just a bunch of trees," he scoffed. "People get lost because they're stupid. We'll go in, spend a night, and come out laughing at how dumb these stories are." Along with Chris were Emma, his girlfriend, Marcus, the skeptic, Tara, who loved ghost stories, and Alex, the quiet one who always went along with the crowd. They packed their gear, including a flashlight and a map, and ventured into the woods one crisp October evening, determined to debunk the tales once and for all. Hashtag into the woods. The forest felt alive, more so than any place they'd ever been. As the group trudged deeper, they noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. No bersang. No wind rustled the leaves. It was as if the woods were holding its breath, waiting. After an hour, the group found a clearing and set up camp. Tara pulled out her phone and began live streaming. "Say hi to my followers," she chirped, aiming the camera at her friends. "We're in Whispering Woods. If you don't hear from us tomorrow, call the cops." Emma rolled her eyes, but Chris grinned. "Yeah, tell them to send pizza too." As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. They built a fire and huddled close. Tara told spooky stories, her flashlight under her chin, while Chris carved a stick with his pocket knife. Alex sat silently, staring into the flames. Suddenly, there was a sound, a low, guttural noise, like a growl, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "It's just an animal," Marcus said, though his face was pale. But the sound came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any animal they'd ever heard. Chris stood, holding his knife. "Stay here," he ordered, stepping toward the noise. Hashtag the first sign of horror. He disappeared into the trees, his flashlight beam bobbing. Minutes passed, then a scream, a blood-curdling, primal scream, ripped through the night. "Chris!" Emma yelled, leaping to her feet. The others followed, their flashlights flickering as they ran toward the sound. They found Chris slumped against a tree, his face pale and eyes wide. Blood seeped from 3 deep gashes across his chest. "What happened?" Emma cried, shaking him. "Something big," Chris gasped. "It was watching us, waiting." The group dragged him back to the camp, but the mood had shifted. Fear clung to them like a second skin. "We need to leave," Tara said, her usual bravado gone. But when they tried to find their way out, the map made no sense. Paths twisted and looped back on themselves. Trees that should have been familiar seemed alien. The woods weren't just alive, they were sentient. Hashtag the first death. By midnight, the group was hopelessly lost. Chris's condition worsened. He was feverish and mumbling incoherently. As they argued about what to do, the growl came again, louder, closer. Alex pointed his flashlight toward the sound. In the beam stood a figure. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grin filled with jagged teeth. Before anyone could react, the figure lunged, its clawed hand wrapped around Tara, yanking her into the darkness. Her screams echoed for a moment, then silence. The remaining four fled, leaving the campsite and their gear behind. Hashtag the woods close in. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. Trees seemed to move when they weren't looking. Shadows stretched unnaturally long. And always they heard the thing behind them, following, taunting. Emma tripped, twisting her ankle. "Go!" she screamed as the others tried to help her. But Chris, delirious, began laughing. "It's not the woods," he whispered. "It's _him, _ the slasher. He doesn't want us to leave." "Shut up!" Marcus yelled, dragging Emma to her feet. But Chris was right. The slasher wasn't just some crazed killer. He was something else, something ancient tied to the forest. Hashtag the final stand. By dawn, only Alex, Emma, and Marcus were left. They stumbled into a clearing, their bodies battered and spirits broken. Chris had vanished during the night, his screams cutting off abruptly. In the clearing stood an old cabin, its windows boarded, its door ajar. Inside, Alex said, "We can barricade ourselves." The cabin was worse than the woods. Bones littered the floor. Rusty tools, knives, saws, axes, hung on the walls. And in the center of the room was a table, stained dark with blood. "It's his lair," Emma whispered, horrified. As if summoned, the slasher appeared in the doorway, blocking their escape. Marcus charged him with a broken chair leg, but was swatted aside like a fly. The slasher advanced on Emma, who screamed and swung a rusted axe she'd found. It buried itself in his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. It was Alex who saved her. He lit a gas lantern and hurled it at the slasher. Flames engulfed the creature, and its inhuman scream shook the cabin. Hashtag escape and aftermath. The fire spread quickly. Alex and Emma dragged Marcus from the burning cabin. The slasher's screams echoed behind them, but they didn't look back. They stumbled out of the forest at dawn, battered and traumatized. The police didn't believe their story. Search parties found no trace of the slasher or the cabin, just an empty clearing where the fire had been. Emma and Alex left Blackthorn County, trying to move on, but they knew the truth. The slasher wasn't dead. He couldn't die, and the woods were still out there, waiting for their next victims. The mask of Hollow Creek _ Hashtag the legend. In the isolated mountain town of Hollow Creek, there was a legend, a chilling tale whispered by the locals to warn newcomers. Decades ago, a man named Ezekiel Granger lived in the town. He was a woodworker known for crafting ornate masks for the festivals. But his masks weren't just wood and paint. They were enchanted, or so people claimed. One night, a mob accused Ezekiel of witchcraft after a series of disappearances. They burned his house to the ground while he was still inside. Legend says his spirit survived, bound to his most infamous mask, carved from the wood of a cursed willow. The mask was said to grant its wearer unnatural strength, but at a terrible cost. It consumed their soul, leaving only a hollow vessel. No one in town had seen the mask in years, but every decade or so, strange disappearances plague Hollow Creek, always ending with a bloodbath. Hashtag a new beginning. Kara, a young journalist from the city, arrived in Hollow Creek to write a feature about small-town legends. She wasn't a believer in ghost stories, but she knew readers loved them. With her was her best friend and photographer, Ben. The town had an eerie charm: quaint wooden houses, foggy streets, and a dense forest that loomed like a wall around the town. The locals were polite but distant, their eyes shadowed with unspoken fears. At the inn, Kara struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawthorne. When Kara mentioned the mask, the woman's face turned ashen. "Don't go digging where you shouldn't," she warned. "Some things are better left buried." But Kara was undeterred. She found an old map of the town in the library, marking the ruins of Ezekiel Granger's workshop deep in the forest. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the mask. The next day, Kara and Ben ventured into the woods. The forest was unnervingly silent, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. After hours of searching, they found the ruins, a blackened foundation choked with moss. In the debris, Kara spotted something glinting. She dug it out and froze. It was a mask, unlike anything she'd ever seen. The wood seemed to shimmer, and the eyes were hollow, as if it were staring into her soul. "Don't touch it," Ben said, his voice shaky. But Kara couldn't resist. She picked it up, and for a moment, the world shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows darker. She shook it off as her imagination. "We're taking it back," she said. "This will make the story incredible." Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the first death. That night, strange things began happening. Kara had vivid nightmares of fire, screaming faces, and a figure wearing the mask, its hollow eyes glowing red. She woke up drenched in sweat, only to find Ben sitting at the edge of his bed, staring at the mask. "It's just a mask," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound like his own. The next morning, Ben was gone. Kara searched the town, but no one had seen him. That evening, a scream echoed from the woods. The sheriff led a search party, and they found Ben, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, his face twisted in terror. Nearby, a tree had strange carvings etched into it, symbols no one recognized. Kara was devastated, but the mask was gone. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the curse awakens. As days passed, the town descended into chaos. People began disappearing, and those who returned were different. They moved stiffly, spoke in whispers, and their eyes seemed vacant. Rumors spread that the mask had been found and that its wearer was walking among them. Kara became obsessed with the mask. She started digging through archives, learning about Ezekiel's rituals and the mask's supposed powers. She pieced together a horrifying truth. The mask didn't just grant power. It turned its wearer into a vessel for Ezekiel's spirit. The only way to break the curse was to destroy the mask, but it could only be burned in the cursed willow where the wood had been taken. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag a town in fear. One night, the mask's new wearer revealed himself. It was Pastor Miller, a kind man who had always been a pillar of the community. But with the mask on, he was unrecognizable. He became a monster, taller, stronger, his movements unnatural. He slaughtered a family in the town square, leaving a warning carved into their door. The Hollow must be fed. Panic swept through Hollow Creek. People barricaded themselves in their homes, but the killings continued. Karen knew she had to act. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the final confrontation. Kara gathered a small group of brave townsfolk, including Mrs. Hawthorne, who revealed she had once seen the mask's power firsthand. Together, they devised a plan: lure the masked figure to the cursed willow and destroy it. As the night fell, the group ventured into the woods, armed with torches, axes, and a gasoline canister. The forest seemed alive, its branches reaching out like claws. The masked figure appeared, his hollow eyes glowing. He moved with inhuman speed, cutting through the group one by one. Mrs. Hawthorne was impaled on a tree branch, her final scream echoing through the woods. Kara managed to reach the willow, the mask's aura pressing down on her like a physical weight. She lit the gasoline-soaked tree and turned to face the masked figure. "Come on!" she screamed, holding a burning torch. The figure lunged, but Kara ducked, slamming the torch into the mask. Flames engulfed it, and a guttural scream erupted, not from the figure, but from the mask itself. The figure collapsed, writhing as the mask burned. #Aftermath. By dawn, the cursed willow was nothing but ash. The killing stopped, and the surviving townsfolk emerged from their homes, shaken but alive. Kara left Hollow Creek, her story written but never published. Some truths, she decided, were too dangerous to share. But in the ashes of the willow, something stirred. A charred fragment of the mask lay buried, waiting for someone foolish enough to uncover it again. Underscore the silent bells of Blackwater Abbey underscore. #, the Abbey's curse. High on a cliff overlooking the stormy sea stood Blackwater Abbey, a crumbling monastery abandoned for over a century. Once home to a devout order of monks, the abbey had been the site of a massacre so brutal that its bells were said to have rung on their own, tolling in mourning for the dead. No one knew exactly what happened that night. Some claimed the monks had summoned something they couldn't control, a force from beyond. Others said the bells themselves were cursed, forged from the iron of a shipwreck where dozens had drowned. All anyone agreed on was this: the abbey was haunted, and those who ventured there never returned. #, the dare. For decades, Blackwater Abbey was left undisturbed, until a group of urban explorers decided to test their luck. Erica, a thrill seeker with a love for history, had heard the stories and convinced her friends, Ryan, Claire, and Nate, to join her on a weekend trip to the coast. "We'll document everything," she said, packing her camera. "If we can prove the legend is fake, it'll go viral. If it's real, well, that's even better." They arrived at the Abbey on a gray, windswept afternoon. The place was as forbidding as the legends claimed, with jagged spires reaching into the sky and windows like blackened eyes. Above them, the bell tower loomed, silent and still. As they crossed the threshold, a sense of unease washed over them. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. "Let's split up," Erica suggested. "Why does it always have to be splitting up?" Nate muttered, but no one listened. #, the first signs. Erica and Ryan explored the nave, filming the decaying murals and shattered pews. Claire and Nate headed for the crypts, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. At first, it was thrilling. The Abbey was a treasure trove of eerie sights, faded tapestries, rusted chalices, and weathered inscriptions. But soon, strange things began to happen. In the nave, Erica heard faint whispers, too low to make out. When she turned, she found Ryan staring at the bell tower, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The bells," he whispered. Erica strained her ears, but heard nothing. "You're imagining things." But Ryan wouldn't stop staring. Meanwhile, in the crypts, Nate found an old wooden door marked with a strange symbol. Against Claire's protests, he forced it open, revealing a hidden chamber. Inside was a rusted iron bell, smaller than the ones in the tower. "It's just a bell," Nate said, stepping closer. But Claire backed away. "Don't touch it." Before she could stop him, Nate reached out, and the moment his fingers brushed the bell, a deafening clang echoed through the Abbey. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the awakening. The sound wasn't just loud, it was wrong. It reverberated in their chests, shaking the walls and floor. Nate dropped the bell and staggered back. "Why did you do that?" Claire screamed. Above them, the main bells began to toll, one after another, though no one had touched them. Their deep, mournful tones filled the Abbey, and with each chime, the air grew colder. Erica and Ryan ran into the crypts, panicked. "What the hell is going on?" Erica shouted. "The bells," Ryan murmured. "They're calling something." As if in response, a low moan echoed through the Abbey, rising to a scream. Shadows slithered along the walls, pooling into shapes, figures in monks' robes, their faces featureless. "They're not real," Erica said, clutching her camera. But when one of the figures reached for her, she felt its icy grip. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the descent. The group fled, but the Abbey seemed to shift around them. Hallways stretched endlessly, doors led to nowhere, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. "They won't let us leave," Ryan said, his voice distant. He was still staring at the bell tower. "What are you talking about?" Erica snapped. "They need one of us," he said, walking toward the tower. Erica grabbed his arm, but his strength was unnatural. He shoved her aside and disappeared up the stairs. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the sacrifice. Claire, Erica, and Nate followed him, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The stairs seemed to spiral forever, but at last they reached the belfry. Ryan stood at the edge, staring at the largest bell. His eyes were blank, his face expressionless. "They called me," he said. "I have to answer." Erica shouted, lunging for him, but the shadows were faster. They surged forward, forming a wall between her and Ryan. She could only watch as he stepped onto the bell's platform and pulled the rope. The bell rang, louder than anything they'd heard. The sound shattered the windows and shook the tower. Ryan screamed, but it was cut short as his body twisted, his flesh turning to ash. The shadows surged into the bell, and the tolling stopped. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the escape. The silence that followed was deafening. The shadows receded, and the group stumbled down the stairs, their ears ringing. When they reached the nave, the Abbey was still. The oppressive air had lifted, and the bell tower was silent once more. "Is it over?" Claire whispered, but Erica wasn't so sure. She glanced at the camera slung over her shoulder. It was still recording. Hashtag, hashtag, hashtag the final revelation. Back in the safety of their hotel, Erica reviewed the footage. Most of it was distorted, static, flickering images, and garbled audio. But one part was clear: the moment Ryan rang the bell. In the frame, shadows surged into his body, and for a split second, his face changed. It wasn't his face at all. It was something else. Erica froze the frame, staring at the image. The face looked like a monk's, but its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a grin. As she watched, the video began to glitch, and a sound filled the room: the faint tolling of a bell.